On the altar, Xian Luo and Moxion's faces turned as pale as death. Clearly, they hadn't anticipated that the floating pagoda ancestor would appreciate Mu Chen so much. Even knowing that Mu Chen's relationship with the floating pagoda ancient clan was strained, the ancestor still decided to entrust the Eightfold Pagoda to him. Ancestor. The two of them tried to persuade him further. I have already made my decision. The floating pagoda ancestor waved his hand decisively, his tone firm. He then looked at the two of them and said, "Go back and tell the elders in the clan. The reason our floating pagoda clan has lasted since the ancient times is because we have always had exceptional talents. But now, you two and the others have become increasingly stagnant. If this continues, the glory of our clan may soon fade." By the end of his speech, his voice had turned stern, clearly angry about the floating pagoda clan's treatment of Mu Chen as a sin child because of his mother's background. Xian Luo and Moxion stood silently, their heads lowered in submission. Yet in their eyes, jealousy and resentment still flickered. They never imagined that the sin child they had once looked down upon would become the greatest winner of the ancient sacred abyss, while they, who should have been the center of attention, now stood in the shadow of Mu Chen's brilliance. "Mu Chen, come with me to receive the inheritance," said the floating pagoda ancestor, ignoring the two of them. With a wave of his sleeve, spiritual light surged, and the two of them disappeared from the altar. Once the two vanished, Xian Luo and Moxion finally raised their heads, their faces dark with fury. "Just let him inherit it." Moxion's voice was filled with resentment. Xian Luo was silent for a moment, then sneered, "A sin child, and he's worthy of the Eightfold Pagoda? Since the ancestor is determined to choose him, so be it. But whether he can take the Eightfold Pagoda out of the sacred abyss continent is another matter, and that's not up to the ancestor to decide." As he spoke, a cold gleam flickered in his eyes. Moxion was taken aback. "What do you mean?" Xian Luo coldly replied. "Do you think Black Radiance and Elder Moin will let the Eightfold Pagoda fall into Mu Chen's hands? Once they find out, even if the Grand Elder issued an order, they'll throw it away and take matters into their own hands." Moxion nodded slightly. Indeed, if Black Radiance and Elder Moin took action, no matter how capable Mu Chen was, he would never escape the pursuit of two heavenly supremes. Let him enjoy it for now. When the spiritual light before Mu Chen faded, he found that the surroundings had changed. He was now in a tower, its walls weathered and worn, faint ancient patterns barely visible. A sense of ancient and desolate energy filled the tower. "This is..." Mu Chen looked towards the floating pagoda ancestor, sensing some familiar fluctuations in the air. "This is the interior of my floating pagoda," the floating pagoda ancestor said with a nostalgic smile. "But with my true body's fall, this floating pagoda has lost its former glory and is slowly crumbling over time." Mu Chen nodded slightly. Even though the tower had begun to decay, he could still feel an indescribable aura circulating, sending a chill down his spine. The floating pagoda ancestors will sat in the tower and smiled at Mu Chen. "Do you know the origin of the Eightfold Pagoda?" Mu Chen shook his head. All he knew was that the Eightfold Pagoda ranked among the 36 supreme divine abilities of the Great Thousand Worlds, with boundless power. Beyond that, he knew nothing else. The floating pagoda ancestor wasn't surprised and continued. "This supreme divine ability was created by me at the peak of my power. It was during the time when the extraterritorial evil clan was invading the Great Thousand Worlds. I killed countless demons, and in this pagoda, I sealed dozens of demon emperors, many of whom were as powerful as the immortal grade heavenly supremes." Mu Chen couldn't help but gasp in awe. To have sealed dozens of demon emperors was an extraordinary achievement, equivalent to subduing dozens of heavenly supremes. "It was precisely because I sealed so many demon emperors that the demon sealing pagoda became unstable. Later, I had an idea. I would refine these demon emperors into guardians for the floating pagoda." Mu Chen was taken aback. To refine the demon emperor into a guardian? That wouldn't be easy, as it would require erasing the demon emperor's original consciousness, much like crafting a puppet. However, generally speaking, the power of a puppet is far weaker than in its original form. If that were the case, the Eightfold Pagoda would obviously not qualify to be listed among the 36 supreme divine abilities. Naturally, I am aware of that, the floating pagoda ancestor said with a hint of pride. That's why I ultimately engraved the guardians I refined onto the pagoda, linking them to my own body. I then used secret techniques to cleanse and temper them day and night, ensuring their powers were maximized. Chen couldn't help but click his tongue in admiration. The floating pagoda ancestor truly lived up to being one of the peak experts of the ancient era in the Great Thousand Worlds. His methods were indeed extraordinary. However, the only regret is that the failure rate of refining such guardians was too high. Out of the dozens of demon emperors, only 3 succeeded. In the years that followed, I used the wars to seal and refine more demon emperors. It was only a year before my fall that I truly completed the Eightfold Pagoda, the floating pagoda ancestor sighed. Chen wiped the cold sweat from his brow. To have refined dozens of demon emperors and succeeded with only 3? The failure rate was incredibly high. After all, demon emperors were not like cabbages. They were powerful beings comparable to the heavenly supreme. One could only imagine how merciless the floating pagoda ancestor must have been in hunting down demon emperors back then. No wonder, to this day, no one had ever managed to cultivate the Eightfold Pagoda. Just the materials needed for its cultivation were nowhere to be found. After all, it was impossible to use a heavenly supreme of the Great Thousand Worlds as raw material for such a process. If it were discovered, the entire Great Thousand Worlds would likely never allow it. Thinking of this, Chen couldn't help but chuckle bitterly. Even if he knew how to cultivate the Eightfold Pagoda, what use would it be? Seeing the expression on his face, the floating pagoda ancestor smiled and said, "The true value of the Eightfold Pagoda does not lie in its cultivation method, but in the Eightfold Pagoda itself." As he spoke, the floating pagoda ancestor raised his hand. The broken pagoda trembled, and Chen saw cracks suddenly appear along its walls. With the sound of breaking, 8 beams of crimson light shot out from the walls of the pagoda. The 8 beams of red light descended, circling around the floating pagoda ancestor's body. At that moment, Chen saw clearly that they were 8 red beads, their surfaces inscribed with patterns that looked slightly fierce and menacing. Just a glance at these 8 red beads made Chen feel his blood boil, and a murderous intent surged from his heart. Buzz. At this moment, the sacred floating pagoda within Chen's body released a divine light, immediately purging and dispelling the murderous intent, allowing him to regain clarity. Phew! After recovering, Chen instinctively took a step back, his gaze filled with apprehension as he looked at the 8 red beads. These things were truly sinister. If they fell into the hands of an ordinary person, they would likely turn them into a murderous monster in no time. This is the core of the Eightfold Pagoda, the pagoda beads, the floating pagoda ancestor said, pointing to the 8 red beads with a slight smile. He then waved his sleeve, and the beads suddenly erupted with crimson light. The light gradually formed 8 colossal shadows. These 8 shadows, each roughly 100 feet tall, were monstrous in appearance. Some resembled fierce vajras, while others looked like menacing rakshasas. But without exception, their bodies exuded an intense, terrifying sense of oppression. Chen gazed at these 8 colossal figures, his mind connecting the dots. These are the Eightfold Pagoda? The floating pagoda ancestor nodded, smiling. I see now. Chen marveled, realizing that the Eightfold Pagoda wasn't so much a supreme divine ability as it was an alternative sacred artifact. This was because one didn't need to cultivate through arduous training to gain it. Instead, by inheriting the 8 pagoda beads, one could directly cultivate the Eightfold Pagoda. The true value of the Eightfold Pagoda lay not in its cultivation method, but in these 8 beads, forged by many demon emperors. It was truly a stroke of luck to have crafted these 8 pagoda beads, the floating pagoda ancestor sighed. I believe that even if I were given another chance, I might not be able to refine them again. Chen nodded in agreement. Indeed, refining those demon emperors into guardians was no simple feat. There had been far too many elements of luck involved. However, since these materials come from demon emperors, they carry an aura of ferocity. Even an ordinary heavenly supreme, if they used them for too long, would have their hearts corrupted by the killing intent, the floating pagoda ancestor continued. He then looked at Mu Chen with satisfaction. But fortunately, you possess the sacred floating pagoda, and with its protection, this murderous aura won't affect you in the slightest. As your own strength increases, the power of the Eightfold Pagoda will grow as well. However, since they cannot cultivate, every battle will consume a vast amount of supreme spiritual liquid. You must be fully prepared for this, the floating pagoda ancestor reminded. More supreme spiritual liquid? Mu Chen's face immediately fell. He already had the bottomless pit of the mystic dragon army that devoured supreme spiritual liquid, and now there was another gluttonous beast. One could imagine that in order to activate the Eightfold Pagoda, the supreme spiritual liquid consumed would be measured in the tens of millions at the very least. Additionally, the floating pagoda ancestor paused, his face turning serious. If your strength is not sufficient, never force the Eightfold Pagoda's power to increase. After all, they are demon emperors. Although they have been refined, their ferocity is deeply ingrained in their blood and flesh. If their power reaches a point beyond your control, they could very well turn on you. Mu Chen's face grew grave as he nodded. It seemed the Eightfold Pagoda was a double-edged sword. Since that's the case, the floating pagoda ancestor fixed his gaze on Mu Chen, his palms slightly raised, causing the 8 crimson beads to slowly rotate. Are you ready to accept the inheritance of the Eightfold Pagoda? In the first layer of the 4 sacred pagodas, guarded by the supreme spirit ancestor, the sounds of battle echoed loudly around a massive altar as spiritual energy and demonic chi collided, creating deafening explosions that caused the entire layer to tremble. To protect the altar and destroy it, powerful beings from the Great Thousand Worlds and the extraterritorial evil clan were locked in a fierce battle. In the northwest corner of the altar, several figures huddled together, the central figure being Luo Li. Surrounding her were Ling Shi, Wen Qingxian, and others, all vigilantly watching their surroundings. Their group wasn't particularly eye-catching in the grand scheme of the battlefield. After all, the number of Earth's supreme great perfection experts alone was almost 2 hands worth, not to mention the powerful figures from the extraterritorial evil clan. Fortunately, no experts on the level of Shi Tianyu had appeared in this layer, so despite the intense battle, there was still no clear victor, and the fight remained stalemated. Luo Li, what is that woman doing? Suddenly, when Qingxian poked Luo Li, her phoenix eyes looking toward the distance. Near the altar, there was a large-scale battle circle, at the center of which stood a woman dressed in white, her features delicate with a slightly charming look. By now, when Qingxian and the others had realized that this woman, by Xun'er, was Luo Li's competitor, they both sought the inheritance of the supreme spirit ancestor in this layer. Bai Xun'er was highly skilled, and she was always surrounded by several formidable experts, including a few Earth Supreme Great Perfection Masters. The lineup she had formed was undoubtedly the most powerful in this layer. Thus, they were able to get the closest to the altar and resist the attacks from other extraterritorial evil clan experts. At this moment, within the intense battle circle, Bai Xun'er glanced toward Luo Li with her beautiful eyes. Her lips slightly parted, and then she gently sat down. Her jade-like hands quickly formed seals, and spiritual light gathered at her crown. It seemed as though invisible waves of light were emanating in a circular pattern. She's trying to communicate with the sleeping will of the supreme spirit ancestor, Luo Li said, her eyes narrowing slightly. In this layer, no one had yet released the sealed remnant soul of the heavenly demon emperor, so the supreme spirit ancestors will remain dormant. Clearly, if Bai Xun'er managed to communicate with the supreme spirit ancestor's will, she could use its power to sweep away the entire extraterritorial evil clan. At that point, she would undoubtedly become the greatest contributor, and the Taiyuan Annihilation Light, one of the 36 supreme divine abilities in the Great Thousand Worlds, would naturally be hers. We must stop her. Ling Shi frowned. If Bai Xun'er obtained the Taiyuan Annihilation Light, Luo Li's mission would undoubtedly end in failure. Mu Chen had brought them all to Luo Li's side, hoping they would assist her in completing her task. If they failed in this as well, it would be difficult to explain. I'll go disrupt her. Long Xiang clenched his fists, his voice deep and resolute. Despite the presence of several Great Perfection Earth Supremes on the opposing side, he showed no signs of fear. However, his movement was stopped by Luo Li, who gently shook her head. The cultivation technique she practices should be the Tai Ling scripture from the Supreme Spirit Ancient Clan. It is said that the Supreme Spirit Ancestor also practiced this same technique. She is likely trying to use this method to communicate and awaken the will of the Supreme Spirit Ancestor. That's a good idea, but it's not as easy as she thinks, Luo Li continued. From the information she had gathered, she knew that in ancient times, among the 4 great ancestors, the Supreme Spirit Ancestor was the first to fall, and his will was now in a constant state of slumber, making it incredibly difficult to awaken. Xun'er might not succeed. Seeing the calmness of Luo Li, everyone also suppressed the anxiety in their hearts and decided to observe the situation. Meanwhile, from a distance, Xun'er suddenly glanced toward them. After seeing that they weren't making any moves, she smiled faintly and waved lightly to the powerful figures around her. These figures immediately withdrew their subtle gazes from Luo Li and the others, surrounding Xun'er to protect her. This woman is really cautious, always watching us, Wen Qingxian remarked, raising an eyebrow. Someone who can become the candidate saintess of the Supreme Spirit Ancient Clan is no easy opponent, Luo Li replied with a slight smile. Xun'er was alone, but she skillfully surrounded herself with numerous powerful individuals who were willing to assist her. Such methods are not something just anyone could master. As they spoke, the mysterious spiritual light above Xun'er's head grew even more dazzling, shining like a full moon, its radiance spreading across the entire world. The light expanded and reached the altar. In the center of the altar, an ancient stone tablet seemed to tremble for a moment. A look of joy appeared on Xun'er's delicate face, but it was short-lived. She soon realized that the stone tablet had fallen silent again, as still as a rock, not a single movement. Xun'er gritted her silver teeth, frantically channeling her spiritual energy. The spiritual light above her head continued to expand, enveloping the ancient stone tablet in waves. Boom, boom. Her actions drew the attention of some extraterritorial evil clan experts, who immediately launched an attack. But they were swiftly repelled by the powerful figures surrounding her. Come on, wake up! Xun'er bit her red lips tightly, continuously circulating the Tai Ling scripture, trying to communicate with the will of the Supreme Spirit Ancestor. But the result was as if she had thrown a stone into the sea. There was no response. After testing for a while, Xun'er finally opened her beautiful eyes with a slightly pale face, filled with frustration. She looked up at the distant altar and muttered to herself, "Do I need to step onto the altar to awaken the ancestors' will?" But doing so would surely attract the interference of many extraterritorial evil clan experts. If any of them reached the altar and awakened the heavenly demon emperor's remnant soul, things could become very troublesome. "Miss Xun'er, did you fail?" A tall man approached and asked with concern. Xun'er smiled softly and nodded. "Thank you for your efforts." Upon receiving her gentle smile, the man immediately felt energized. "Miss Xun'er, don't worry. Once we escort you to the altar, you will certainly be able to awaken the will of the Supreme Spirit Ancestor. As for them, you needn't worry. If even Miss Xun'er can't do it, they definitely won't be able to." He was clearly referring to Luo Li and her group, and it was obvious that, thanks to Xun'er's explanation, they knew that Luo Li was her biggest competitor. Xun'er smiled softly and said, "You shouldn't say that. We still have to be cautious of Luo Li." As she spoke, her gaze shifted to the direction of Luo Li and the others. Her eyes suddenly narrowed as she saw that Luo Li, who had been still until now, had sat down in a meditative position. It seemed that Luo Li noticed her gaze as she slowly looked up. Their eyes met briefly, then quickly parted. Xun'er's gaze withdrew, her beautiful eyes narrowing slightly. Is Luo Li also planning to communicate with the Supreme Spirit Ancestor's will? However, as she thought of this, a meaningful smile appeared at the corner of her lips. She knew that in recent months, Luo Li had been named the candidate saintess by the Red Flame Old Immortal, yet she had never cultivated within the Supreme Spirit Ancient Clan. To someone with no experience in their cultivation techniques, attempting to communicate with the Supreme Spirit Ancestor was nothing short of a fantasy. "Luo Li, do you think you can do it?" Wen Qingxian asked anxiously, recalling how Xun'er had failed earlier. They had already realized how difficult it was to awaken the will of the supreme spirit ancestor. After all, Xun'er had at least cultivated the Tai Ling scripture, but Luo Li had never practiced any of the supreme spirit ancient clan's techniques or divine abilities. Luo Li smiled faintly and said, "Do you know why the red flame old immortal has so much confidence in me, thinking I can obtain the Tai Ling annihilation light?" When Qingxian shook her head, Luo Li smiled charmingly and said, "Because I have cultivated the Luo Shun divine body." When Qingxian was completely confused. What did cultivating the Luo Shun divine body have to do with the supreme spirit ancient clan? Luo Li raised her delicate face and looked at the ancient altar, saying, "The red flame old immortal once said that in ancient times, the supreme spirit ancestor was a passionate soul." Passionate about whom? Ling Shi seemed to understand something. Luo Li gave a mischievous smile and said, "He was infatuated with the previous owner of the Luo Shun divine body, our Luo God clan's ancestor, Luo Shun." "I understand now. You're planning to use a beauty trick." "No, a divine body beauty trick to awaken the supreme spirit ancestor's dormant will," Wen Qingxian exclaimed, slapping her jade-like hand in surprise. Luo Li blinked her bright eyes playfully and said, "For the Tai Ling annihilation light, I guess I'll just have to sacrifice a little of our ancestor's beauty." When Qingxian and the others exchanged looks. Was that really going to work? Luo Li said no more. She formed a seal with her jade-like hand, and a vast spiritual light erupted from behind her. The light filled the world, and a slender, elegant figure, as if containing the ultimate beauty of the world, slowly appeared behind her. The Luo Shun divine body, the most beautiful supreme divine body in the great thousand worlds. As the spiritual light burst forth, the slender and elegant figure materialized on the battlefield. In that instant, the once chaotic battlefield seemed to freeze for a moment. Countless gazes were drawn to the incredibly beautiful supreme divine body, and everyone's eyes flickered with astonishment. Before the Luo Shun divine body, Luo Li's delicate figure radiated with spiritual light, enveloping her. Her hair, like a galaxy, danced without wind, her robes swaying. She radiated an astonishing beauty. Now Luo Li is so beautiful. When Qingxian marveled. At this moment, Luo Li, standing side by side with the Luo Shun divine body, her features glowed with a crystalline light, her originally glass-like eyes now even more translucent. Such beauty instantly overshadowed everything around them, even causing Wen Qingxian and Xun'er to appear somewhat dull in comparison. So beautiful. In the distance, the powerful figures who had surrounded Xun'er also gazed at Luo Li under the Luo Shun divine body, their eyes filled with awe. And Xun'er, who had been smiling faintly, now had a stiff expression. Her beautiful eyes were fixed on the breathtaking supreme divine body, and after a moment, she spoke slowly, her voice heavy with disbelief. "Luo Shun divine body." After all, she was a candidate saintess from the supreme spirit ancient clan, well-versed in the ways of the world. She instantly recognized that the supreme divine body Luo Li manifested was none other than the famous Luo Shun divine body of the great thousand worlds. It was renowned as the most beautiful supreme divine body in the great thousand worlds, possessing not only extraordinary beauty, but also immense power. Countless female cultivators longed to cultivate such a divine body. Xun'er, too, was one of them. So, when she saw that Luo Li had actually cultivated the Luo Shun divine body, even she couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. If she could cultivate such a supreme divine body, in time, she would undoubtedly become one of the brightest stars in the great thousand worlds. Then why is she using the Luo Shun divine body now? Xun'er furrowed her brows, murmuring to herself, confused. It seemed she didn't quite know the story of the Supreme Spirit Ancestor's past obsession with Luo Shun. As for the numerous astonished gazes from all directions, Luo Li did not pay them any attention at this moment. Her mind gradually connected with the Luo Shun divine body, and then a boundless spiritual light erupted from the body of the Luo Shun divine body. The light spread, rapidly approaching the altar, and then poured down onto the ancient stone tablet. Just as the spiritual light from the Luo Shun divine body descended, the stone tablet, which had remained still up until then, suddenly shook violently. The tremor was unlike the slight quiver that Xun'er had experienced earlier. Instead, it grew increasingly intense, with the booming sound intensifying. Seeing this, Xun'er's heart sank. This scene was clearly beyond her expectations. She never imagined that after Luo Li activated the Luo Shun divine body, the ancient stone tablet would respond so quickly. "Miss Xun'er, what should we do?" The strong figures surrounding Xun'er asked in unison. Xun'er's gaze flickered, and she sighed softly. "It seems that I am outmatched this time." She lightly bit her red lips, looking pitiful, causing the surrounding strong figures to feel a pang of sympathy. They then whispered, "Don't worry, we can disrupt their actions, while Miss Xun'er can head directly to the altar and forcefully awaken the will of the Supreme Spirit Ancestor." Upon hearing this, Xun'er's eyes brightened for a moment, but she shook her head. "How can I let you all take such risks? Luo Li is surrounded by powerful figures as well. Haha, just two great perfection experts. They are no threat." The man who had spoken to Xun'er earlier laughed loudly, his tone filled with confidence, for on their side, there were 4 great perfection experts. "Let's go." Clearly enjoying the admiration in Xun'er's eyes, he waved his hand and, with the other 3 great perfection experts, shot out toward Luo Li's position. Xun'er watched their figures, a slight smirk appearing on her red lips. Her gaze, calm as water, lingered on Luo Li for a moment before she turned and swiftly headed toward the altar. "Be careful." As the 4 great perfection experts charged toward Luo Li, Wen Qingxian and the others immediately sensed the danger and called out, "Idiots seeking death." Long Xiang snorted coldly and surged forward, his body surrounded by glowing energy. The dragon elephant surged forth, crashing toward the 4 great perfection experts with terrifying force. Behind him, Wen Ziyu followed closely, and further behind, Ling Shi's sleeves flickered with spiritual light, rapidly forming a powerful spirit array. As Ling Shi and the others moved to block their path, Luo Li remained unfazed. She continued to channel the Luo Shun divine body, transmitting its fluctuating energy into the stone tablet, which trembled even more violently. Buzz, buzz. The tremors intensified. Several minutes later, the violent shaking suddenly stopped. Upon seeing this, Xun'er, who was rushing toward the altar, immediately felt a surge of joy. But before her joy could fully surface, she saw a vast, ancient light soar from the stone tablet on the altar, reaching up into the sky. The light condensed above the altar, eventually taking the form of a shadowy figure. The figure appeared to be of middle age, with a firm face. Though not handsome, there was a profound, weathered aura about him. He appeared in the sky and gazed directly at the Luo Shun divine body, his eyes filled with deep nostalgia. "I never imagined that after so many millennia, I would see the Luo Shun divine body again." Although his gaze was fixed on the Luo Shun divine body, the figure that appeared in his mind was clearly the one from his distant memories. Luo Li looked up at the light figure with her glass-like eyes and said clearly, "Senior Tai Ling, one of the 4 sacred pagodas has already fallen. Please lend us your strength to eliminate the demons." The figure of Tai Ling Ancestor, formed from his will, appeared directly before Luo Li. He gazed at her face, and his expression softened. "What is your relationship with Luo Shun?" "She is my ancestor," Luo Li replied respectfully. "No wonder you bear some resemblance." Tai Ling Ancestor smiled, his eyes fixed on Luo Li's cheek. His gaze was intense and affectionate, but Luo Li knew that he wasn't actually looking at her. He was looking at her ancestor, Luo Shun. "I never thought that my dormant will would ever be awakened, and by a descendant of hers. She always said that we had no fate, but it seems that was not the case." Tai Ling Ancestor chuckled lightly. Luo Li secretly stuck out her tongue. It seemed that this was another of her ancestor's failed suitors. Fortunately, the will of the Supreme Spirit Ancestor did not linger too much on past memories. His gaze swept around, and when he saw the extraterritorial evil clan surrounding the altar, his eyes darkened. Has the will of the Spear Ancestor been destroyed, and one of the 4 sacred pagodas broken? The light in the Supreme Spirit Ancestor's eyes flickered, then suddenly paused. In a somewhat surprised whisper, he muttered, "Has the remnant soul of the blood zombie heavenly demon emperor been destroyed as well? Did the floating pagoda old ghost act so swiftly?" Upon hearing this, Luo Li, standing in front of him, felt a jolt in her heart. The remnant soul of the heavenly demon emperor sealed by the floating pagoda ancestor had been destroyed? It must have been Mu Chen. Though she had no definite answer, Luo Li's intuition as a woman led her to immediately suspect that it must have been Mu Chen's doing. "You little girl, you woke me up just in time. If those extraterritorial evil clans managed to rescue the heavenly demon emperor's remnant soul, I'd probably end up like the spear ancestor." The supreme spirit ancestor smiled at Luo Li. Among the four ancestors, he had suffered the most severe injuries, so his will was the weakest. If the heavenly demon emperor's remnant soul he had sealed ever broke free, he likely wouldn't have the ability to deal with it again like the floating pagoda ancestor had. The supreme spirit ancestor extended his finger, lightly tapping the center of Luo Li's delicate forehead. Spiritual light erupted from his fingertip and surged into her. As the spiritual light entered, Luo Li's body trembled slightly, and she felt an immense, unfathomable spiritual energy roaring inside her. However, the power didn't belong to her. "Clean it up for me." The supreme spirit ancestor gave one last deep look at Luo Li's delicate face, nostalgia welling up in his eyes. His body gradually faded, until it dissipated entirely. Luo Li gently nodded, her figure flickering and appearing on the shoulder of her Luo Shun divine body. Her glass-like eyes coldly scanned the chaotic battlefield. Then, she raised her jade hand. Whoosh! A streak of light shot from the fingertips of the Luo Shun divine body. It expanded rapidly with the wind, instantly becoming a surging galaxy thousands of miles long, filled with boundless spiritual power. The galaxy roiled, first sweeping its tail to send the four great perfection experts, who were fighting fiercely against Long Xiang, Wen Ziyu, and the others, vomiting blood and retreating, their faces filled with panic. However, Luo Li paid them no mind. With a flick of her slender jade finger, the dazzling galaxy began sweeping the battlefield. Those extraterritorial evil clan experts caught within the galaxy were swiftly reduced to ashes, their bones vanishing without a trace. The battlefield, once in a deadlock, was instantly turned around with Luo Li entering, bolstered by the supreme spirit ancestor's will. The extraterritorial evil clan forces began to crumble, and eventually, they could no longer bear the fear and fled in panic. On the other hand, the experts from the Great Thousand World were emboldened, chasing them down with renewed vigor. Below the altar, Xun'er stopped in her tracks. Her teeth gritted against her red lips, her jade hand clenched tight. She knew that this time, the battle was lost for her. She never imagined that, despite all the awakening methods of the Supreme Spirit Ancient Clan failing to revive the Supreme Spirit Ancestor, he would awaken so quickly just by sensing the presence of Luo Shun's divine body. Above the sky, Luo Li looked at the battlefield, which was now becoming clear, and let out a relieved sigh. She could feel that the vast and unfathomable spiritual power within her was vanishing at an astonishing rate. When the last trace of spiritual power dissipated, Luo Li's eyes suddenly brightened. At that moment, an ancient and majestic stream of information passed through her mind. So, this is the Supreme Spirit Heavenly Light. In the ruined tower, Mu Chen sat in silence. Suddenly, he opened his eyes wide, and a brilliant crystal light burst forth. A crystal-clear floating pagoda shot out. The sacred floating pagoda spun in front of Mu Chen, then rapidly expanded, turning into a giant tower that descended from the sky, enveloping both Mu Chen and the will of the floating pagoda ancestor. The tower was filled with shimmering crystal light. Mu Chen eagerly looked up at the walls of the tower, where 8 images appeared on the smooth surfaces. The 8 images were all fierce and terrifying, radiating an intensely oppressive aura. Anyone who gazed at them would be overwhelmed by the murderous energy, losing their sanity. However, Mu Chen looked at these terrifying images with an unmistakable look of wild joy. "Is this the Eightfold Pagoda?" Mu Chen murmured to himself, still somewhat in disbelief. After all, the Eightfold Pagoda was one of the 36 most unparalleled divine abilities in the Great Thousand Worlds. Such a level of divine ability was enough to make even a heavenly supreme at the Saint Grade hesitate and yearn for it, let alone a perfect Earth Supreme. Chen stared at the 8 ferocious images on the tower wall. With a thought, spiritual light surged from the images, and the 8 figures immediately detached from the tower wall, transforming into gigantic entities. They hovered in midair, exuding a terrifying aura of power. This kind of power, Chen lightly sensed it, a smile of astonishment curling at the corner of his mouth. Based on his estimation, if he were to encounter Yu again now, all he would need to do was trap him in the pagoda. Once the Eightfold Pagoda was activated, the outcome would be certain. As for Xian Luo and Moxin, they would have no chance of resisting in this tower. The power of these 8 guardians was enough to crush any powerful being below the heavenly supreme level. Now, Chen wielded 2 of the most supreme divine abilities in the Great Thousand Worlds. With such combat strength, he could rightfully be called the strongest under the heavenly supreme. Indeed, this is the sacred floating pagoda. It's unparalleled in its holiness. If it weren't for the sacred floating pagoda, you probably wouldn't have been able to control them so easily, said the floating pagoda ancestor, smiling slightly from the side. The materials used to craft the Eightfold Pagoda were truly from the Demon Emperor, carrying a fierce and violent nature. If it weren't for Chen's possession of the sacred floating pagoda, which inherently had the power to resist all evil and seal its energy, it would have taken years of nurturing the pagoda core before he could even hope to imprint it onto his own pagoda. Chen nodded deeply, acknowledging the truth of the floating pagoda ancestor's words. When activating the power of the Eightfold Pagoda, he could feel the vicious aura emanating from it. Without the suppression of the sacred floating pagoda, that malicious energy would have been enough to send him into disaster. Clearly, even if an ordinary person were to acquire such a top-tier divine ability, they likely wouldn't be able to cultivate it. If they tried, they would only bring calamity upon themselves. Thank you, Senior, Chen said sincerely, looking at the floating pagoda ancestor. If it weren't for the latter's favor, he likely wouldn't have had the chance to obtain the Eightfold Pagoda. The floating pagoda ancestor smiled and shook his head. I should be the one thanking you for inheriting my divine ability. Chen smiled and didn't say anything further, but inwardly, his respect for the floating pagoda ancestor grew even more. By the way, Senior, how are things in the 4 sacred pagodas now? Chen suddenly remembered Luo Li and quickly asked. Aside from the layer held by Spear Ancestor being lost, the other 2 layers are intact. The 4 sacred pagodas have mostly stabilized now. The remnant soul of the heavenly demon emperor that escaped from Spear Ancestor's lair cannot leave. It will eventually be completely wiped out by the 4 sacred pagodas' power. The floating pagoda ancestor replied with a smile. It seemed the crisis had truly been resolved. Chen let out a sigh of relief upon hearing this. If that was the case, then the layer where Luo Li was should have also secured victory. He just wondered whether the inheritance of the Supreme Spirit Heavenly Light had ultimately fallen into Luo Li's hands. As Chen pondered, the floating pagoda ancestor raised his head and gazed at the broken Eightfold Pagoda for a moment in silence before smiling. Since there is still some spiritual energy left in the pagoda, let me give you a little more fortune. With a wave of his sleeve, brilliant spiritual light began to condense in the pagoda, appearing as tangible as substance itself. This was true spiritual light, a manifestation of spiritual energy solidifying into a real form. Buzz. The spiritual light surged downward and, upon touching Chen's heavenly spirit crown, transformed into vast spiritual energy, pouring into his body in a torrent, like a crown of spiritual force. The moment Chen sensed the spiritual energy, he understood the floating pagoda ancestor's intention. He clearly wanted to infuse the remaining power of the Eightfold Pagoda into Chen, helping him further advance. As the spiritual light continued to flow into Chen's body, the already dilapidated Eightfold Pagoda began to decay at an astonishing speed, growing dimmer. Chen's body, however, began to radiate a glowing light, like crystal. His flesh subtly became translucent under the overwhelming spiritual energy, and a faint fragrance emanated from his body. This was because all the impurities in his flesh had been completely eliminated, leaving it pure and flawless, which explained the faint, fragrant scent. The cleansing light of spiritual energy washed over him for an unknown length of time. When Chen finally opened his eyes again, he saw that the pagoda had already dimmed to the point of almost shattering, with cracks climbing up its surface. Beside him, the floating pagoda ancestor's form had also become increasingly illusory, clearly a sign that his energy had been completely drained. Chen sensed his own body and discovered that his flesh and blood emitted a crystal-like glow. Powerful, mysterious spiritual energy surged through his meridians like a torrential flood, constantly flowing. Half-step Great Perfection Realm. Chen immediately sensed his current state. Although he hadn't reached full Great Perfection, he was actually relieved about that. The old man only used the remaining power to refine your body and allowed extra spiritual energy to merge with your own, elevating you to the half-step Great Perfection. But I did not help you break through completely, the floating pagoda ancestor said with a smile. I know you're ambitious, and your future achievements might even surpass mine. I wouldn't want to forcefully accelerate your progress and leave you with future troubles. Chen scratched his head and gave a slightly embarrassed smile. He had indeed been worried that the floating pagoda ancestor, in his moment of indulgence, would push him straight to the half-step Great Perfection. While this would have given him more power in the short term, it could cause long-term problems. In the path of cultivation, one must progress step by step. Chen's talent was extraordinary, and his cultivation speed was already fast enough. He didn't need to rush his advancement. What he wanted was natural progress. By solidifying his foundation now, he would have the chance to challenge the heavenly supreme realm in the future, and even attain the saint grade within that realm. With the half-step Great Perfection, after a period of self-cultivation, I can take the sacred spirit pill and complete my breakthrough in perfect condition, with no side effects. Chen thought to himself. All right, all the benefits I have for you are pretty much given, kid. The floating pagoda ancestor clapped his hands, snapping Chen back to reality, and teased, You should pay attention. Chen stood up and solemnly bowed to the floating pagoda ancestor with deep respect. Over the years, this was the first time he had shown such reverence to someone from the floating pagoda ancient clan. The floating pagoda ancestor didn't refuse this time. Instead, he accepted the bow with a direct and confident air. From a bloodline perspective, he was Chen's ancestor, so this was well within his rights. Chen. Yes. Chen replied respectfully. The floating pagoda ancestor stared at him for a long moment before slowly speaking again. No matter the grudges between you and the floating pagoda clan, your bloodline is still connected to ours. I hope you can promise me that, if one day the floating pagoda ancient clan faces utter destruction, you will step in and protect us once. Chen froze. At this moment, he was only a lower earth supreme. In front of the floating pagoda ancient clan, he was like an ant. Yet, the floating pagoda ancestor had said such a thing to him. A complex emotion surged in his heart as he looked into the old man's expectant eyes. After a moment, he gently nodded. Seeing Chen nod, the floating pagoda ancestor's face revealed a relieved smile, and his form grew even more illusory. Crumbling stones continued to fall from the pagoda, signaling its imminent collapse. I will send you out. You all did well with the 4 sacred pagodas mission. The floating pagoda ancestor waved his sleeve, and a beam of spiritual light enveloped Chen. As space twisted, it immediately swallowed him up. Boom. With Chen's departure, the pagoda instantly collapsed. Huge stones fell, burying the once mighty pagoda, which had once struck fear across the great 1,000 worlds, beneath the rubble. When the spiritual light surrounding Chen dissipated, a cacophony of voices surrounded him. He looked around and realized that he was now outside the 4 sacred pagodas. Around him, many figures had appeared. Clearly, everyone who had entered the 4 sacred pagodas had been teleported out. Chen. A clear voice rang out, and Chen looked up. A smile appeared on his handsome face as he saw Qingxian, Luo Li, and the others hurrying toward him. How did it go? Chen asked, looking at Luo Li with concern. We succeeded, no problem. Luo Li smiled brightly, her sparkling eyes dazzling Chen once more. And you? Chen reached out, gently grasping Luo Li's cool, jade-like hand, and grinned. We are the biggest winners. In the distance, Xian Luo and Moxin gazed at Mu Chen's direction with darkened expressions. After exchanging a look, they muttered to themselves, winners? Wait until you can leave the sacred abyss continent alive before saying that. As the sound faded, they grasped their palms, and a jade talisman appeared in their hands. Crushing it, spiritual light surged forth, enveloping them, and their figures swiftly vanished.